Ever wonder how warriors with obsidian clubs held off soldiers with steel and gunpowder? The Aztecs and Mayans didn't have horses, steel, or guns. So how did they make the Spanish conquest take decades instead of days? Turns out home field advantage meant something completely different when your home was a jungle fortress or a lake city. While Europeans were great at conventional warfare, they weren't prepared for Mother Nature's kill setting. The rainforest wasn't just trees and vines, it was a 24/7 biological weapons factory. Spanish armor worked great for battlefield glory, but turned into personal saunas in 95% humidity with aggressive fungal infections as a bonus feature. The conquistadors learned that heavy metal wasn't a great fashion choice in the tropics. Their thick steel breastplates that could stop arrows became ovens that cooked them from the inside out. Meanwhile, native warriors wore quilted cotton armor called ichawipi that actually breathed in the heat while stopping projectiles. Spanish soldiers started ditching their expensive European gear for native cotton armor, basically admitting that their fancy imported equipment was useless where it actually mattered. The jungle itself became a weapon. While smallpox devastated native populations, the environment hit back with malaria, yellow fever, and parasites that made Spanish soldiers wish they'd stayed home. Both sides brought biological warfare to the table, except one side didn't even know they were playing. Mayans would deliberately flood paths during rainy season, turning roads into swamps where a 1,200-pound horse became about as useful as a boat anchor. They'd remove bridges faster than you can block someone on social media, stranding Spanish forces on the wrong side of rivers. Spanish horses, their biggest tactical advantage on European battlefields, became massive liabilities when they sank into swampland up to their bellies. But the real genius wasn't just nature, it was building cities that were basically impossible to capture. Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, sat on an island in Lake Texcoco with only 3 causeways connecting it to the mainland. Each causeway had removable wooden bridges that could vanish in minutes. The Aztecs could literally delete the only exits while enemy soldiers were still standing on them. Nothing says go home quite like removing the road while someone's still using it. The city itself was threaded with canals that thousands of canoes navigated daily. During peacetime, this was great for commerce. During war, it meant Aztec warriors could pop up anywhere, attack, then disappear into a maze of waterways. Spanish cavalry trained for open field charges found themselves trying to fight in what was essentially a giant swimming pool crossed with a hedge maze. The city had a population of 200,000, making it larger than Paris or London at the time. The canal system meant cavalry charges were completely useless, since horses can't exactly gallop on water. Mayan cities took a different approach, but were equally frustrating to attack. They weren't just ceremonial centers, they were defensive onions with layers upon layers of walls. Every building was positioned to create narrow passages that funneled attackers into kill zones. These passages were so tight that Spanish soldiers had to advance in single file, while Mayan warriors rained projectiles from above. At Mayapan, the Spanish found walls within walls within walls, each layer getting progressively more deadly as you went deeper into the city. You'd think steel versus obsidian would be game over for the natives. It absolutely wasn't. Obsidian blades were actually sharper than surgical steel. The Aztecs literally performed brain surgery with these things. Their primary weapon, Macuahuitl, was a wooden sword embedded with obsidian blades that could allegedly decapitate a horse in one swing. Spanish conquistador Bernal Diaz del Castillo watched one of these weapons nearly cut a horse's head clean off and wrote about it like he'd seen something from a nightmare. These things could slice through bone like butter, though the obsidian would shatter after a few good hits. The Atlatl, a spear-throwing device, could launch projectiles at 90 miles per hour, faster than a Major League fastball. These weren't just regular spears either. Many were tipped with poison from dart frogs or toxic plants that would kill you even if the wound itself wasn't fatal. Spanish armor stopped swords pretty well, but it had gaps at the joints where poison darts could find their mark. Full plate armor turned out to be more like mostly plate armor with convenient dart-sized openings. One Spanish soldier described watching a companion get hit with a dart in the armpit and die within minutes, foaming at the mouth while his skin turned purple. Then there were the psychological weapons. Death whistles that sounded like 100 people screaming in agony at once, basically the Aztec version of psychological warfare through audio terrorism. Spanish peasant soldiers who'd never left their villages before suddenly found themselves surrounded by jungle, 100-degree heat, covered in bug bites, and then they'd hear what sounded like hell itself opening up. Warriors dressed as jaguars and eagles would emerge from the forest looking like something from your worst fever dream. Medieval castles had murder holes where they dropped rocks on attackers. Aztecs had murder sounds that made you question if you were already dead. Europeans expected honorable battlefield combat with armies lining up in neat formations. Instead, they got the 16th century equivalent of guerrilla warfare. Mayan warriors would attack Spanish camps at night, kill sentries, burn supplies, and then vanish into the jungle before anyone knew what happened. No supply lines were safe. Spanish gold shipments had worse delivery success rates than packages during the holiday rush. This was asymmetric warfare centuries before military theorists gave it a name. Native spies learned Spanish faster than any language app could teach them. Within weeks of first contact, indigenous scouts were reporting Spanish conversations word for word. Every native ally the Spanish thought they'd recruited was potentially sending intelligence back to their enemies. The siege of Tenochtitlan lasted 93 days, partly because Aztecs knew every Spanish move in advance. They had interpreters hiding in allied camps, servants in Spanish quarters, and merchants who traded information along with goods. The natives also mastered supply line disruption. They poisoned wells along Spanish march routes, burned crops before armies arrived, and killed pack animals in night raids. This was scorched earth tactics taken to the extreme. Spanish horses required 20 pounds of feed daily, which becomes a real problem when every field for miles has been turned to ash. One Spanish expedition reported that their horses were so hungry that they were eating their own leather reins and saddles. The biggest defense wasn't walls or weapons, though. It was making your enemies fight each other. The Aztec Empire had plenty of enemies among their indigenous groups, sure, but those enemies hated each other just as much. The Spanish thought they were recruiting allies against the Aztecs. In reality, they were stepping into a centuries-old blood feud where everyone had their own agenda, and most of those agendas involved killing their neighbors. Natives spread rumors about Spanish weaknesses faster than social media spreads conspiracy theories. Stories of horses being mortal spread after indigenous warriors managed to kill a few. Suddenly, the mythical horse demon became just big animals that bled like everything else. This information transformed battle strategies overnight. Cortez had 600 men when he started his conquest. The Aztec Empire had millions of subjects. The math only worked because of native allies who did most of the actual fighting, but keeping those allies meant constant negotiation and managing competing interests that often worked against Spanish goals. If you thought medieval biological warfare was nasty, tropical creativity took it to another level. The jungle provided a whole chemistry set of death. Dart frogs with skin toxins that could kill with a touch, plants that caused paralysis, venomous insects that could be weaponized. Natives would poison water supplies with combinations of toxins that made dysentery look like a mild stomachache. Spanish wine versus poison pulque became the worst drinking game in history. Warriors used hornets' nests as grenades, throwing clay pots full of angry insects into Spanish formations. Army ants could be directed towards Spanish camps by leaving trails of food. These weren't normal ants either. They were inch-long insects with mandibles that could pierce leather. One account described Spanish soldiers abandoning their position entirely because millions of army ants were eating them alive, starting with their eyes and any open wounds. When diseases hit indigenous populations hardest, some groups started catapulting bodies of smallpox victims back at Spanish positions, attempting reverse biological warfare. They sent contaminated tribute goods to Spanish camps, hiding infected blankets among supplies. While disease ultimately devastated native populations far worse, they still tried to weaponize it when they could, showing a brutal understanding of contagion that Europeans wouldn't formally develop for centuries. When your enemy thinks they're literally fighting for the gods, surrender isn't even in the vocabulary. Aztec warriors believed dying in battle meant VIP afterlife access, basically getting backstage passes to the best concert in the cosmos. Spanish saw gold and territory, while natives saw cosmic balance and divine mandate. Guess who fought harder when they thought their souls were on the line? It's hard to break morale when your enemy treats death like a promotion to middle management in heaven. Ritual cannibalism wasn't just religion, it was psychological warfare through extreme intimidation. The Aztecs would eat captured Spanish soldiers in public ceremonies, making sure other Spaniards could see it happening. Skull racks called zompantli displayed thousands of heads in neat rows. Spanish soldiers reported having nightmares for years about seeing their companions' heads on poles, still recognizable but their eyes pecked out by birds. Natives spread prophecies about Spanish doom that became self-fulfilling when enough people believed them. They used astronomical events like eclipses to prove the gods were angry at invaders. Even Spanish allied natives started doubting their choices after enough divine signs appeared. One Spanish priest complained that he spent more time trying to counter indigenous prophecies than actually converting anyone to Christianity. The most impressive defense was how quickly natives learned and adapted to European tactics. Within months, indigenous forces understood Spanish cavalry formations and started building specific countermeasures. They dug pit traps designed for horses, basically anti-tank ditches before tanks existed. These weren't random holes either. They were precisely measured to be deep enough that a horse couldn't jump out, but shallow enough that the rider would survive to be captured. By 1521, Aztecs were using captured Spanish swords and were trying to reverse engineer gunpowder from captured supplies. Indigenous forces perfected the false retreat, drawing Spanish forces into prepared killing grounds. They would run away in apparent panic, leading pursuers into valleys where warriors waited on both slopes. They basically figured out the Spanish playbook and started using it against them. Some groups managed to capture horses and learn to ride them. The Spanish must have been shocked when native cavalry suddenly appeared using their own tactics against them. The Mayans took adaptation even further. They learned to make crude gunpowder from sulfur, charcoal, and bat guano found in caves. While their firearms never matched Spanish quality, the psychological impact of Mayans firing back with guns was devastating to Spanish morale. They also developed specific formations to minimize casualties from firearms, spreading out in loose skirmish lines instead of packed formations, making Spanish volleys less effective. The real story's in the numbers. The Aztec Empire maintained organized resistance for 2 full years after Tenochtitlan fell. That's not scattered rebels, that's organized military campaigns with thousands of warriors. Mayan resistance lasted even longer, with some cities holding out for 170 years. The last independent Mayan stronghold, Atlatl, didn't fall until 1697. Newton had already invented calculus by then. The United States would become a country before the last Mayan kingdom fell to European conquest. Spanish forces lost 80% of their soldiers in La Noche Triste, a single night of fighting when they tried to escape Tenochtitlan. That's a higher casualty rate than D-Day, but you won't see Hollywood making movies about indigenous military victories. More conquistadors died from native resistance than from disease in the first years of conquest, which is the opposite of what most people think happened. During the siege of Tenochtitlan, the Spanish and their allies suffered over 800 Spanish deaths and tens of thousands of indigenous allied casualties. The Aztecs inflicted these losses while under siege, suffering from smallpox and running out of food and water. One Spanish account described fighting for a single city block that took 3 days and cost 50 Spanish lives. They had to demolish every building as they advanced because Aztec warriors would reoccupy them at night and attack from behind. The engineering defenses show sophisticated military thinking. The Aztecs turned their entire capital into a death trap. They removed the wooden bridges from causeways at strategic points, isolating Spanish forces on narrow strips of land surrounded by water. They built underwater obstacles, sharp stakes hidden just below the surface that would impale anyone who fell or tried to wade through. Spanish soldiers in armor trying to retreat on a narrow causeway with no bridges, enemy canoes on both sides, and projectiles raining from above faced almost certain death. They dug pits in the shallow parts of the lake and covered them with reed mats that looked solid. Spanish soldiers and horses would crash through into the water over their heads, where the weight of armor meant drowning was almost certain. The Aztecs even developed a system of movable barricades that could be quickly repositioned to channel attackers into kill zones. These weren't primitive fortifications. They were sophisticated defensive systems that required coordinated teams to operate effectively. The psychological warfare went beyond death whistles and intimidating costumes. Aztec priests would perform human sacrifices of captured Spanish soldiers in view of Spanish positions, cutting out hearts while the victims were still alive. The screams carried across the water to Spanish camps. They would then cook and eat parts of the bodies, making sure Spanish sentries could smell the smoke. One Spanish soldier wrote that the worst part wasn't the killing, but hearing their captured companions calling out their names during the ceremonies, begging for rescue that wouldn't come. The Mayans employed different but equally effective psychological tactics. They would leave mutilated Spanish corpses on jungle paths, arranged in threatening positions with obsidian blades still embedded in the bodies. They spread stories that the jungle itself was alive and hungry for Spanish blood. Mayan shamans would perform curse ceremonies just out of weapon range, where Spanish soldiers could see but not stop them. The psychological pressure of constant supernatural threats, combined with the very real physical dangers, broke many Spanish soldiers before any physical wound could. During the Night of Sorrows, La Noche Triste, Aztec warriors coordinated a three-pronged assault. Canoe forces attacked from the water, roof-based warriors threw stones and spears from above, and ground forces blocked both ends of the causeway. The Spanish were trapped in a kill box with no room to form ranks or use cavalry effectively. Horses fell into the water and drowned. Men in armor sank immediately, and portable wealth became death sentences as gold-filled pockets dragged soldiers under. The Aztecs killed over 600 Spanish soldiers and thousands of their indigenous allies in one night. At the highland Mayan fortress of Atlatl, defenders used the terrain brilliantly. The city sat on a plateau surrounded by deep ravines with only narrow approaches. When Spanish forces attacked, Mayan warriors retreated slowly, drawing enemies up steep paths while raining projectiles from above. They prepared the pass with loose stones that would give way under weight, sending attackers tumbling into ravines. The Spanish needed 3 separate assaults and indigenous allies familiar with the terrain to finally breach the defenses. The siege of Tenochtitlan shows urban warfare at its most brutal. Every house became a fortress, every roof a fighting position. Aztec warriors would let Spanish forces advance down streets, then attack from buildings on both sides while others blocked retreat. They fought room to room, using the Macuahuitl's chopping power in close quarters where Spanish swords had less room to maneuver. Spanish accounts describe having to demolish buildings stone by stone because leaving any structure intact meant enemies behind their lines by nightfall. The natives also excelled at night fighting, something European armies typically avoided. They knew their cities and forests in complete darkness, while Spanish forces needed torches that made them perfect targets. Aztec warriors would swim silently across canals at night, climb into Spanish positions, kill sentries with obsidian knives, and vanish before alarms could be raised. The psychological impact of never being safe, even in fortified camps, wore down Spanish morale as much as direct combat. When natives captured Spanish crossbows, they didn't just use them, they manufactured bolts from local materials. They studied Spanish armor to find weak points, particularly at the joints and under the arms. They learned that Spanish horses feared certain sounds and smells, using drums and smoke to panic cavalry charges. Some groups created decoy camps to waste Spanish ammunition, understanding that gunpowder was a limited resource that took months to resupply. Naval warfare on Lake Texcoco was its own special hell. The Aztecs had thousands of war canoes, each carrying 3 to 5 warriors. They developed tactics specifically to counter Spanish brigantines, using swarm attacks where dozens of canoes would converge on a single ship. They stretched low ropes between canoes to tangle oars and rigging. They used fire arrows and burning pitch to try setting wooden ships ablaze. While Spanish ships had advantages in size and firepower, the Aztecs made every water battle costly. The indigenous allies that joined the Spanish often had their own agendas that complicated conquest. Tlaxcalan warriors who hated the Aztecs would sometimes refuse orders that didn't align with their goals. They wanted to destroy their enemies, not necessarily help establish Spanish rule. This created command problems where Spanish captains couldn't fully control their indigenous forces, leading to battles being fought in ways that prolonged conflict rather than ending it quickly. Women played crucial roles in defense that often get ignored. They prepared weapons, managed supplies, and in some cases fought directly. During the siege of Tenochtitlan, Aztec women threw stones from rooftops and poured boiling water on attackers. They maintained the logistics that kept defenders fighting for months under siege. Mayan women would carry messages through Spanish lines, their presence considered non-threatening until the Spanish realized they were coordinating resistance movements. Disease, while devastating to indigenous populations, didn't immediately end resistance. Communities developed quarantine practices, isolating sick individuals to slow spread. They continued fighting even while suffering massive population losses. Some groups deliberately sent sick individuals into Spanish allied indigenous camps, understanding that disease could be a weapon even if it hurt them more. The fact that organized resistance continued despite losing sometimes 90% of population to disease shows incredible resilience. So how did empires without steel, horses, or guns resist for so long? They turned every disadvantage into an advantage somewhere. Geography became ammunition, religion became armor, and knowledge became the most powerful weapon of all. The conquest took decades, not because natives were weak, but because they were incredibly adaptable, innovative, and determined. Next time someone says primitive civilizations couldn't stand against European technology, remind them that some Mayan cities were still fighting when Bach was composing symphonies. That's not defeat, it's making colonization as inconvenient as humanly possible for nearly 2 centuries. What's the most ingenious defensive tactic you learned about today? Drop it in the comments, and if you want to know how Pacific Islanders made European colonization even harder, that video's coming next week.